The stainless steel instruments glinted under the surgical lights, cold and sharp, perfectly arranged on the Mayo tray. The steady beeps of the heart monitor filled the room, each sound an eerie reminder of Jason's frailty. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs was the only other noise, constant, irritating, and a reminder that no matter how horrific life became, this room would always remain impartial, clinical, and indifferent. Just another procedure. Terrica's pulse pounded in her ears, muffling the chatter of the surgical team around her. Her gloved hand hovered over Jason's abdomen as if testing the air, her grip on the scalpel tight and deliberate. The weight of the blade felt heavier than usual, as if it carried the burden of history, of what had happened in the darkened alleys all those years ago. She tried to shake the memories, but they gripped her mind like a fucking barbed wire. Every breath felt sticky, like the air was thickened with the sour stench of rain-soaked brick and his sweat. She could feel the knife vibrating in her hand, or maybe that was just her nerves. No way to tell. Doctor Toussaint, the anesthesiologist said softly from behind the surgical mask. Vitals are stable. We're ready. Terrica exhaled sharply through her nose, trying to steady herself. Just another night. Just another surgery. Nothing more. She adjusted her grip, letting muscle memory take over. It was supposed to be simple. Incision, clamp, cut, close. Except this wasn't just another patient. This was him, the guy from her past. Her hands shook despite her best efforts to steady them. The scalpel hovered just above Jason's abdomen, but her mind pulled her back into the grip of that rainy night. His sneering voice, the taste of bile in her throat, the press of his clammy hand over her mouth, stifling her scream. She had buried that night, or so she thought. And yet here it was, dug up from the grave, laid bare on the operating table beneath her hands. Dr. Toussaint. The surgical nurse's voice was cautious, like she could sense something was off. Terrica blinked hard, forcing herself back into the present. Her heart thundered, and her throat tightened with a sense of inevitability that chilled her to her core. But she had a choice now, a terrible, all-consuming choice. Doctor, the anesthesiologist prompted again, sensing the hesitation. Let's get this done. The words felt alien on her tongue, mechanical and lifeless, but they were enough to keep the team moving. She traced the scalpel down his abdomen, the blade whispering through skin and muscle like silk. Blood welled up along the incision, slow and dark, pooling beneath the suction. The nurses worked like clockwork, suctioning the wound and clamping vessels with quick, efficient movements. To them, this was routine. To her, it was anything but. As her hands moved, her thoughts drifted. Fucking do it. Slip the blade a little deeper. Cut something essential. No one will ever know. It'll just be an accident. Another complication. The temptation was unbearable. She leaned in, her gaze boring into his slack, sedated face. His eyelids fluttered faintly as if his unconscious mind were still trying to fight. His lips moved, barely. A breathless whisper of words escaped. Don't. Terrica froze, her pulse pounding harder now, hammering in her chest like the frantic beating of wings. Did he know? Could he sense her, even through the anesthetic haze? His lips twitched again, and her ears filled with the phantom sound of that vile, raspy voice. Her stomach lurched. She gritted her teeth so hard her jaw ached. This was her chance. Her one chance to take back the power he had stolen from her all those years ago. to make him feel the same helplessness, the same fear. One tiny slip of the scalpel, and no one would question it. No one would know it wasn't an accident. Her hand trembled as the scalpel hovered over a critical artery. Doctor, Toussaint, the nurse at her side, frowned, sensing her hesitation. Are you okay? Terrica sucked in a breath, her fingers tightening around the scalpel's handle. She felt the weight of the room pressing down, on Kant, hasn't down her, like the walls themselves were judging her, daring her to make the wrong move. She could feel Jason slipping further into unconsciousness, his body a limp, broken thing beneath her hands. She could end this. She could end him. The beeping of the heart monitor quickened slightly, a warning. Fucking do it. Slice his ass deep. No one will miss him. No one will care. Her hand twitched, but then something stopped her. A voice, her own voice, cutting through the fog of rage and fear. You're not him. Don't become him. Terrica exhaled slowly, her heart still hammering, but her mind suddenly cleared. She adjusted her grip on the scalpel, and with one smooth, precise motion, she continued the surgery. She worked methodically, seizing the inflamed appendix and clamping off the bleeding with the skill of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The surgical team moved in sync with her, unaware of the war that had just raged inside her mind. Within minutes, the appendix was out, bagged, and the wound was being stitched shut, clean, efficient, no accidents, no complications. As she tied the final suture, she felt an odd sense of calm wash over her. Jason lay unconscious beneath the sheet, breathing steadily, his life now safe in her hands. The nurse smiled. Nicely done, doctor. Terrica gave a small nod, her voice low and steady. Thank you. They wheeled Jason out of the theater and into recovery. Terrica stood at the sink, scrubbing the blood from her gloves, the warm water rushing over her hands like rain. She stared at her reflection in the mirror above the sink. A tired woman with haunted eyes, but a woman who had chosen to rise above the darkness. When the orderly wheeled Jason's gurney into the recovery room, he was still unconscious, his chest rising and falling. With each shallow breath, the scar on his face twitched slightly, as if even in sleep, some part of him sensed what had just transpired. Terrica stood at the door for a long moment, watching him. She could walk away now, leaving him to his fate. Maybe he would live out the rest of his days at Pineview Pastures, a forgotten ghost in a decaying nursing home. Or maybe his sins would catch up to him someday, but not today. She turned away, pulling off her gloves with a crisp snap, and left the recovery room without another glance. Outside, the night was still thick and humid, the air clinging to her skin like a second layer. But for the first time in years, she felt light, free. She had chosen not to become a monster, because she could have killed him for raping her years ago, but chose not to. She would not let his darkness consume her light, and that, in the end, was victory enough. As Terrica stepped into the parking lot and felt the warm breeze against her face, she knew one thing for certain. Some doors were better left closed.